The funeral home chapel smelled like wilted carnations and broken dreams. I sat in the back row, invisible as always, watching my family perform their grief like a rehearsed play. My mother, Patricia, dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had never seen real tears, while my father, Robert, stood at the podium delivering a eulogy that painted my brother Marcus as some kind of war hero. The problem was, Marcus had died in a training accident 3 weeks into basic training. He'd never seen combat, never deployed, never even finished his first month of service. But facts had never mattered much in the Sullivan family narrative. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Captain Isabella Izzy Chen-Sullivan, though my family had long since forgotten the weight those words carried. To them, I was just the quiet daughter who worked some vague government job and lived alone in a sterile apartment across town. They had no idea that my morning briefings included classified intelligence from 3 different continents, or that my signature authorized operations that could shift the balance of international relations. They saw what they wanted to see, which was nothing at all. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in civilian clothes at my brother's military funeral while my parents spun tales of his imaginary heroism. Marcus had lasted exactly 21 days in the Army before a routine obstacle course accident claimed his life. 21 days. I had been serving my country for over 15 years, rising through ranks that most people couldn't even pronounce. And yet here I was, listening to my father describe Marcus as the family's greatest contribution to national defense. The chapel was packed with people who barely knew Marcus, but they knew the story my parents had crafted. In the week since his death, my mother had transformed his brief military stint into a legend. She'd posted daily on social media about her fallen soldier son, collecting sympathy and admiration from friends who'd never heard her mention Marcus during the years he spent bouncing between community colleges and dead-end jobs. My father had ordered custom memorial t-shirts with Marcus's basic training photo, the only military picture that existed of him, printed alongside words like hero, patriot, and ultimate sacrifice. I watched this performance from my usual position in the shadows, feeling the familiar sting of being erased from my own family's story. My phone buzzed quietly against my leg. A text from my aide. General, the Pentagon briefing has been moved to 1400 hours. Transportation will be ready at your location. I glanced at the message and slipped the phone back into my purse, the weight of my real life pressing against the suffocating fiction surrounding me. The funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes, approached the podium to announce that military honors would be rendered by the local VFW Honor Guard. 6 elderly veterans shuffled to the front, their uniforms crisp despite their age, their faces solemn with the gravity of their duty. They didn't know Marcus personally, but they understood the sacred trust of honoring a fallen service member. What they didn't understand was that they were about to participate in my parents' elaborate fiction. My mother leaned across the aisle to whisper loudly to her sister, my Aunt Caroline. "The Army is sending someone special to present the flag," she said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure others heard. "A real officer. They said Marcus made quite an impression during his service." I felt my jaw clench. Even in death, they couldn't let Marcus rest without embellishing his story. The real officer was likely a local recruitment station commander doing his monthly duty, nothing more. As the honor guard took their positions, I found myself studying the faces around me. Neighbors who'd watched Marcus struggle through high school, family friends who'd seen him arrested for petty theft, former classmates who knew he'd enlisted only after exhausting every other option. Yet here they sat, nodding along with my parents' revision of history, either too polite or too uncomfortable to challenge the narrative. The VFW Honor Guard began their ceremony with practiced precision. Despite their advanced age, their movements were sharp, their voices strong as they called out commands that echoed through the chapel. These men understood honor in a way my family never had. They'd earned their respect through service, sacrifice, and commitment that stretched far beyond 21 days. Watching them render honors to Marcus felt like watching Shakespeare performed by masters for an audience that couldn't distinguish it from a children's play. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my deputy, Colonel Martinez. "Ma'am, CNN is requesting a statement about the Pacific Fleet repositioning. Should I refer them to Public Affairs?" I quickly typed back, "Handle it through normal channels. Radio silence until after 1500. Even at my brother's funeral, the weight of my actual responsibilities followed me like a shadow my family couldn't see. The chaplain began reading from prepared remarks, clearly working from notes my mother had provided. He spoke of Marcus's distinguished service and his commitment to defending freedom, words that felt hollow when applied to someone who'd spent more time in the infirmary than in training. I wondered if Marcus would have wanted this fabrication, or if he would have preferred the simple truth, that he was a young man who died tragically before he had the chance to become the soldier he might have been. My thoughts drifted to my own entry into military service, a path that began not with patriotic fervor, but with practical necessity. Fresh out of MIT with a degree in international relations and computer science, I'd been recruited by a Defense Department program that promised to pay off my student loans in exchange for a 4-year commitment. That was 17 years ago.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
What started as a financial transaction had become a calling I never saw coming, leading me through assignments that took me from the Pentagon to classified locations that didn't appear on any public maps. The difference between my journey and Marcus's was stark, but it wasn't just about duration or success. It was about invisibility. My achievements were classified, my operations were need to know, my very presence in certain rooms was a state secret. When I came home for holidays, I couldn't share stories about my work, couldn't explain why I was traveling so frequently, couldn't even mention some of the countries I'd visited. This necessary secrecy had become my family's excuse to dismiss my entire career as unimportant. I remembered the Christmas 3 years ago when my cousin David, fresh out of law school, had dominated dinner conversation with stories about his first court case. My parents hung on every word, asking questions, offering congratulations, treating his minor victory as if he'd argued before the Supreme Court. When the conversation finally turned to me, my mother asked her standard question, "How'd your little computer job going, Isabella?" I'd tried to explain that my work involved strategic analysis and international security, but my father cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Government work," he'd said dismissively. "Safe, boring, and probably unnecessary." That same week, I'd returned to Washington to brief the Joint Chiefs on a cybersecurity threat that could have crippled the Eastern Seaboard's power grid. The operation my team developed and executed prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on civilian infrastructure. But that victory, like all my others, was invisible to the people who'd raised me, classified at levels they didn't even know existed. The honor guard finished their rifle salute, 3 sharp volleys that echoed through the chapel and out into the parking lot where late arrivals stood respectfully by their cars. The sound was crisp, professional, and deeply moving, even in service of a narrative I knew to be false. These veterans understood something my family had never grasped, that honor isn't about the stories we tell, but about the service we render, witnessed or not. As the flag-folding ceremony began, I noticed a disturbance near the chapel entrance. A black sedan with government plates had pulled up, and 2 figures in dress uniforms were stepping out. My stomach dropped as I recognized the protocol. This wasn't the local recruiting station commander my parents had been expecting. The insignia on the approaching officers indicated much higher rank, the kind that only appeared for very specific reasons. My mother noticed them too, her face lighting up with vindicated pride. "See," she whispered to my father, loud enough for 3 rows to hear, "I told you they were sending someone important. Marcus really was special." I wanted to sink through the floor. Someone at the Pentagon had clearly misunderstood the situation, probably assuming that a Sullivan family funeral involved the Sullivan who actually mattered to national security. The approaching officers were here for me, not Marcus, but they were about to walk into a performance that would be impossible to navigate without destroying my family's carefully constructed mythology. The senior officer, a colonel I recognized from joint briefings, scanned the chapel with the methodical precision of someone trained to assess and adapt to unexpected situations. His eyes passed over the crowd, the honor guard, my parents at the front row, and then landed on me in the back. I saw the moment of recognition, the slight nod of acknowledgement, the brief confusion as he processed why I was sitting in civilian clothes at what he'd clearly been told was a military funeral for a family member. I gave him the slightest shake of my head, hoping he'd understand the signal to play along with whatever script he'd been given. His expression shifted to neutral professionalism, the mask we all learn to wear when dealing with situations that didn't match the briefing. His aide, a younger major I didn't recognize, was looking between his superior and me with obvious confusion, clearly trying to understand the dynamic he'd walked into. The chapel had gone quiet, all attention focused on these new arrivals who represented actual military authority rather than the VFW's ceremonial presence. My parents rose from their seats, my father straightening his tie, and my mother smoothing her dress, both of them preparing to receive what they assumed would be recognition of their son's service. The irony was suffocating. The highest-ranking military officials to ever enter this small-town funeral home were here because of me, but they would have to pretend they were here for Marcus. The colonel approached my parents with the bearing of someone who delivered difficult news to families many times before. His voice was respectful but formal as he introduced himself and expressed condolences for their loss. My mother practically glowed with pride at being addressed by such a high-ranking officer, while my father shook hands with the gravity of someone who believed he was being recognized as the father of a hero. What happened next would have been comical if it wasn't so heartbreaking. The colonel, operating from incomplete information and trying to navigate a situation he clearly hadn't expected, began speaking about the importance of family sacrifice and the debt of gratitude owed to those who support our service members. He was threading a diplomatic needle, offering genuine condolences while avoiding any specific claims about Marcus's service that might be inaccurate. My mother, however, heard only what she wanted to hear. She began elaborating on Marcus's dedication and his natural leadership abilities, describing a young man who bore no resemblance to the brother I'd known. My father joined in, sharing fictional anecdotes about Marcus's childhood dreams of military service, stories I'd never heard because they never happened. They were performing for an audience of one colonel who was too professional to correct them and too kind to walk away. The most painful moment came when my mother gestured toward me in the back and said, "This is our daughter Isabella. She has some little government job, nothing like Marcus's service, of course." The colonel's eyes found mine across the chapel, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Professional composure wore with what I could only assume was surprise at hearing a decorated general described as having a little government job by her own mother. I gave him another subtle signal to let it pass, and he did, simply nodding politely in my direction before turning his attention back to my parents. But the moment lingered in the air between us, heavy with unspoken understanding. Here was a senior officer who knew my reputation, my record, my actual importance to national security, listening to my own family dismiss me as irrelevant while celebrating a fiction about their son. The colonel approached my parents with the bearing of someone who'd delivered difficult news to families many times before. His voice was respectful but formal as he introduced himself and expressed condolences for their loss. My mother practically glowed with pride at being addressed by such a high-ranking officer, while my father shook hands with the gravity of someone who believed he was being recognized as the father of a hero. What happened next would have been comical if it wasn't so heartbreaking. The colonel, operating from incomplete information and trying to navigate a situation he clearly hadn't expected, began speaking about the importance of family sacrifice and the debt of gratitude owed to those who support our service members. He was threading a diplomatic needle, offering genuine condolences while avoiding any specific claims about Marcus's service that might be inaccurate. My mother, however, heard only what she wanted to hear. She began elaborating on Marcus's dedication and his natural leadership abilities, describing a young man who bore no resemblance to the brother I'd known. My father joined in, sharing fictional anecdotes about Marcus's childhood dreams of military service, stories I'd never heard because they'd never happened. They were performing for an audience of one colonel who was too professional to correct them and too kind to walk away. The most painful moment came when my mother gestured toward me in the back and said, "This is our daughter Isabella. She has some little government job, nothing like Marcus's service, of course." The colonel's eyes found mine across the chapel, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Professional composure warred with what I could only assume was surprise at hearing the decorated general described as having a little government job by her own mother. I gave him another subtle signal to let it pass, and he did, simply nodding politely in my direction before turning his attention back to my parents. But the moment lingered in the air between us. Here was a senior officer who knew my reputation, my record, my actual importance to national security, listening to my own family dismiss me as irrelevant while celebrating a fiction about their son. The ceremony continued with the presentation of the folded flag to my mother, who received it with the solemnity of someone accepting a Medal of Honor. The colonel's words were carefully chosen, honoring Marcus's intent to serve while avoiding any claims about achievements that didn't exist. It was a masterful performance of military diplomacy, offering comfort to grieving parents while maintaining truthfulness about their son's brief service. As the formal ceremony concluded, people began filing out of the chapel, many stopping to offer condolences to my parents and to marvel at the presence of such high-ranking officers. I remained in my seat, watching my family accept praise for a sacrifice they hadn't made and recognition for service that had lasted 3 weeks. The disconnect between their performance and reality felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The colonel lingered after most guests had departed, clearly wanting to speak with me but uncertain how to navigate the family dynamics he'd witnessed. My parents were surrounded by well-wishers, basking in the reflected glory they believed Marcus's service had brought them. I finally stood and made my way toward the exit, hoping to avoid any interaction that might complicate the narrative my family had constructed. But the colonel intercepted me near the door, speaking in a voice low enough that only I could hear. "General Sullivan," he said quietly, "I wanted to express my personal condolences for your family's loss." The word general hung in the air between us like a secret that could reshape everything if overheard. I glanced toward my parents, still holding court near Marcus's casket, completely unaware that the most senior military officer in the room was speaking to their dismissed daughter. "Thank you, Colonel," I replied equally quietly. "I appreciate you and Major Williams coming today. I know this wasn't what you were briefed to expect." He nodded, understanding passing between us without need for explanation. We both knew that somewhere in the chain of communication, someone had assumed the Sullivan family funeral involved the Sullivan who actually mattered to military leadership. "Ma'am," he said, his voice even lower, "if you need anything, anything at all, you have my direct line." It was a generous offer from a colleague who understood the complexity of maintaining security clearances while managing family relationships. I thanked him again and watched as he and the major departed, leaving me alone with the weight of secrets my own family couldn't comprehend. The drive home from the funeral was conducted in silence, my parents still processing what they saw as validation of Marcus's importance, while I wrestled with the growing chasm between my real life and their perceptions. They dropped me at my apartment with barely a goodbye, rushing home to continue accepting condolences and sharing stories about their son's brief military career. I stood in my living room, still wearing the simple black dress I'd chosen for my brother's funeral, surrounded by artifacts of a life my family had never bothered to understand. My walls displayed commendations they'd never seen, photographs from ceremonies they'd never attended, and mementos from assignments they'd never asked about. The contrast between this space and the performance I'd just witnessed felt overwhelming. My secure phone rang, pulling me back to the world where my identity mattered. It was Admiral Richardson from Pacific Fleet Command, calling about the repositioning operations we discussed earlier. For 30 minutes, I discussed strategic implications, resource allocation, and timeline considerations that would affect thousands of service members and potentially reshape our presence in the South China Sea. When the call ended, I felt the familiar sense of purpose that came from meaningful work that made a difference even if the people who'd raised me would never understand its importance. The weeks following Marcus's funeral brought a parade of visitors to my parents' home, all drawn by the story of their son's sacrifice and military service. My mother posted daily updates on social media, sharing photos of the folded flag, the colonel's visit, and heartfelt messages about military families. She'd created a shrine in their living room, featuring Marcus's basic training photo, surrounded by candles, flowers, and patriotic decorations that grew more elaborate each day.
I watched this performance from my usual distance, feeling increasingly disconnected from people who shared my DNA but not my reality. My work continued at its demanding pace, involving briefings, operations, and decisions that carried real weight in the world beyond our small town. The contrast between my actual responsibilities and my family's perception of my irrelevance created a cognitive dissonance that grew more difficult to ignore. The breaking point came 3 months after the funeral, during what should have been a simple family dinner. My parents had invited their usual circle of friends, people who'd known Rurkus casually but had become experts on military service since his death. The conversation centered, as it always did now, on their son's brief time in the Army and the recognition his service had brought their family. Mrs. Henderson from next door was particularly effusive in her praise, describing Marcus as a hero who died defending freedom. Mr. Peterson from the hardware store nodded along, adding his own embellishments about the courage it takes to serve. My parents basked in this attention, offering modest disclaimers that only served to invite more praise for their fallen soldier son. When someone finally asked what I did for work, my mother waved dismissively and said, "Oh, Isabella has some desk job with the government, nothing exciting like Marcus's service." The casual dismissal, delivered in front of people who were treating 3 weeks of basic training like a distinguished military career, crystallized everything wrong with my family's narrative. I excused myself from dinner and drove home through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign, as if I was seeing my hometown through different eyes. The disconnect between who I was and how I was seen had become unsustainable. I was living a double life, not by choice but by circumstance, maintaining classified clearances while being dismissed as irrelevant by the people who should have known me best. That night, I made a decision that had been forming for months without my conscious awareness. I would continue honoring Marcus's memory and supporting my parents through their grief, but I would no longer participate in the fiction that minimized my own service while inflating his. The next time military protocol intersected with my family life, I wouldn't signal for discretion or ask colleagues to play along with narratives that erased my identity. I didn't know when that moment would come or what form it might take, but I knew it was inevitable. In a career built on strategy and planning, I recognized the signs of an approaching confrontation that would force truth into situations built on comfortable lies.
The only question was whether I would be ready when that moment arrived, and whether the people who dismissed me for so long would be able to handle the reality they'd refused to see. The foundation was set for a revelation that would reshape everything my family thought they knew about service, sacrifice, and the daughter they'd systematically ignored. The truth was patient, but it wouldn't stay hidden forever, especially in a world where military protocol and family fiction were bound to collide with consequences none of us could predict. The decision crystallized during a late-night briefing session at Fort Belvoir 3 months after Marcus's funeral. I was reviewing intelligence reports from our assets in Eastern Europe when my aide knocked on my office door. Captain Rebecca Walsh, a sharp young officer who managed my schedule with military precision, entered carrying a manila folder that would change everything. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying an unusual hesitation, "I've received a rather unique request through official channels." She placed the folder on my desk with the careful deliberation of someone handling volatile material. "Your hometown's Veterans of Foreign Wars Post has submitted a formal request for military representation at their annual Memorial Day ceremony. They specifically mentioned wanting to honor local families who've lost service members." I opened the folder and immediately understood Captain Walsh's hesitation. The request form listed the Sullivan family prominently, describing Marcus as a fallen hero whose sacrifice deserved recognition alongside other local veterans. The VFW commander had clearly been influenced by my parents' ongoing campaign to memorialize Marcus's brief service, and now that influence was intersecting with official military channels. My first instinct was to decline or delegate the assignment to someone else, maintaining the careful separation I'd built between my professional life and family dynamics. But as I read through the request details, I realized this was exactly the kind of collision between truth and fiction I'd been anticipating. The VFW post wasn't just asking for any military representative. They were requesting someone of sufficient rank to properly honor the families being recognized. Captain Walsh studied my expression with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read her commanding officer's moods. "Ma'am,
I took the liberty of researching the request's origin. It appears your parents have been quite active in local military support groups since your brother's passing. They've organized fundraisers, spoken at recruitment events, and generally positioned themselves as advocates for military families. The irony was suffocating. My parents had transformed Marcus's death into a platform for military advocacy, while continuing to dismiss my actual military career as insignificant. They were becoming local celebrities in veteran circles, sharing wisdom about military life gleaned from 21 days of basic training, while their daughter, with 17 years of active service, remained invisible to them. I closed the folder and looked out my office window at the Potomac River, where early morning joggers were beginning their daily runs along paths I'd traveled countless times during my own fitness training. The weight of command had taught me to see patterns others missed, to anticipate consequences that rippled far beyond immediate decisions. This Memorial Day ceremony wasn't just another speaking engagement. It was an inevitable confrontation that had been building since the moment my family chose fiction over truth. "Captain Walsh," I said finally, "please confirm my attendance at the Memorial Day ceremony and ensure that full dress uniform protocols are observed." She nodded, making notes in her ever-present tablet, but I could see questions forming behind her professional expression. "Ma'am, should I coordinate with local organizers regarding your transportation and security requirements?" The question highlighted another layer of complexity I hadn't fully considered. My security detail, my transportation protocols, my communication requirements, all of these were standard operating procedures that followed me everywhere, but had never intersected with my hometown before. The VFW ceremony would require coordination between federal security agencies and local law enforcement, creating exactly the kind of attention my family had never associated with my desk job. Over the following weeks, I watched from a distance as my parents' excitement about the upcoming ceremony grew to fever pitch. My mother posted daily updates on social media about the honor being accorded to Marcus's memory, while my father began planning what he called a proper military tribute for their son. They had no idea that the military representative they were expecting was the daughter they'd dismissed, and I wasn't going to enlighten them until the moment arrived. The preparation phase revealed just how thoroughly my family had constructed their alternate reality around Marcus's service. My mother had commissioned a custom memorial banner featuring his basic training photo alongside quotes about duty and sacrifice that he'd never lived long enough to embody. My father had organized a reception following the ceremony, complete with patriotic decorations and a guest list that included local officials, veterans groups, and media representatives who'd been covering their advocacy work. Captain Walsh kept me updated on the logistical planning as it unfolded, each detail highlighting the growing disconnect between my family's expectations and the reality they were about to encounter. The local police had been briefed on security protocols for a high-ranking military official without being told who that official was. The VFW post had arranged seating that would accommodate my security detail without understanding why such measures were necessary. The ceremony organizers had planned opening remarks that would introduce their honored guest without knowing they were introducing someone already familiar to half the audience. My work continued at its usual demanding pace throughout this period, briefing congressional committees on cyber warfare threats, coordinating with NATO allies on joint operations, and authorized intelligence-gathering missions that spanned 3 continents. Each day brought decisions that affected thousands of people, resources worth millions of dollars, and strategic positions that influenced international relations. The disconnect between this reality and my family's perception of my irrelevance became increasingly surreal. During a secure video conference with commanders in the Pacific Theater, I found myself planning operations that would reshape our military presence in Southeast Asia, while knowing that my parents were simultaneously planning a memorial ceremony for my brother's 21 days of service. The contrast highlighted everything wrong with their understanding of military sacrifice and achievement. 2 weeks before Memorial Day, I received an unexpected call from Admiral Patricia Thornfield, my direct superior and one of the most respected strategic minds in the Pentagon. Admiral Thornfield was known for her ability to see connections others missed, and her call wasn't about operational matters, but about the unusual request that had crossed her desk for review. "General Chen-Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex political and military landscapes, "I've been reviewing the Memorial Day ceremony request from your hometown. I understand this involves your family directly." The Admiral's ability to connect seemingly unrelated dots was legendary, and clearly she'd identified the personal implications of my accepting this assignment.
Yes, ma'am, I replied, maintaining professional neutrality despite knowing that Admiral Thornfield's interest meant she understood complexities I hadn't yet fully articulated. The request came through normal channels, but the circumstances are somewhat unique. She was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her processing the strategic implications of a senior officer appearing at a ceremony honoring a family member whose service bore no resemblance to their own. "General," she said finally, "I want you to understand that this assignment has my full support, whatever complications it might entail. Sometimes, truth requires a moment of revelation, especially when that truth serves the greater good of understanding what real military service looks like." Her words carried layers of meaning that went far beyond a simple ceremony authorization. Admiral Thornfield was giving me permission to let the truth emerge, whatever consequences that might bring. The conversation with Admiral Thornfield crystallized my resolve in ways I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about correcting my family's misconceptions or claiming recognition I'd never sought. It was about representing the thousands of service members whose contributions remained invisible because their work was classified, their achievements were quiet, or their sacrifices were rendered in ways that didn't generate headlines or social media posts. As Memorial Day approached, my parents' preparations reached a crescendo of anticipation and pride. They arranged for professional photography to document the ceremony, created a guest list that included local media outlets, and even commissioned a small memorial garden at the town cemetery where Marcus was buried. The scale of their preparations reflected their belief that this ceremony would validate everything they'd been saying about their son's service and their family's sacrifice. Meanwhile, my own preparations followed different protocols entirely. My security detail conducted advance reconnaissance of the ceremony site, identifying potential threats and escape routes that had nothing to do with the peaceful small-town celebration my parents were planning. My communications team established secure channels that could reach the Pentagon from a VFW post parking lot. My aide prepared briefing materials that would allow me to handle any crisis that might emerge while I was 3 hours away from Washington. The contrast between these two sets of preparations highlighted the vast difference between my family's perception of military service and its reality. They were planning a celebration based on fiction and emotion, while I was preparing for an assignment that required the same security considerations as any other official engagement. The gap between their expectations and the protocols surrounding my actual position was about to become impossible to ignore. 3 days before the ceremony, I received intelligence reports that required immediate attention, threatening to conflict with my Memorial Day commitment. A situation in the Taiwan Strait was escalating rapidly, demanding coordination between multiple commands and potentially requiring my direct involvement in strategic planning sessions. For several hours, I faced the possibility that duty would require me to cancel my appearance at the hometown ceremony, maintaining the separation between my real life and family expectations. The Taiwan situation resolved through diplomatic channels just hours before I would have been forced to choose between family obligations and national security requirements. But the close call reminded me of something I'd temporarily forgotten in focusing on personal dynamics. My primary responsibility was always to the service and the country, not to correcting family misconceptions or claiming personal recognition. This reminder shifted my perspective on the upcoming ceremony in subtle but important ways. I wasn't attending to prove anything to my family or to claim credit they denied me. I was attending because a legitimate military request had been made through proper channels, and my duty was to fulfill that request with the same professionalism I brought to every assignment. If my family's reaction was dramatic, that was a consequence of their choices, not my goal. Captain Walsh accompanied me on the drive to my hometown, maintaining secure communications and coordinating with the advanced security team that had been monitoring the situation since dawn. The 3-hour journey gave me time to review my remarks for the ceremony, comments I'd crafted to honor all military families while avoiding specific references to Marcus that might force me to validate claims I knew to be false. As we approached the familiar streets of my childhood, I felt an unexpected calm settling over me.
This wasn't the anxious anticipation I'd expected, but rather the focused clarity that came before any significant operation. I'd spent months dreading this moment, but now that it was arriving, I felt ready to handle whatever emerged with the professionalism that had defined my career. The VFW post parking lot was already crowded when we arrived, filled with cars displaying patriotic bumper stickers and license plates honoring various military units. My security detail had arrived earlier and positioned themselves discreetly around the venue, their presence unobtrusive but unmistakable to anyone trained to notice such things. Captain Walsh handled the final coordination while I remained in the vehicle, reviewing my remarks one last time. Through the car window, I could see my parents near the VFW entrance, greeting arriving guests with the enthusiasm of hosts at a party they'd been planning for months. My mother wore a navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, while my father sported a new tie featuring small American flags. They moved through the crowd with the confidence of people who knew they were about to be honored, accepting condolences and praise from neighbors who'd bought into their narrative about Marcus's service. The irony of watching them from behind bulletproof glass while coordinating with federal security agencies wasn't lost on me. Here were two people who dismissed my career as unimportant, standing 50 yards away from a security operation that existed solely because of my actual position in the military hierarchy. The disconnect between their perceptions and reality was about to become impossible to anticipate. Captain Walsh returned to the vehicle with a final update from the ceremony organizers. "Ma'am, they're ready to begin. The VFW commander will introduce you after the opening remarks and flag ceremony. Your parents have been seated in the front row as guests of honor." She paused, studying my expression. "Ma'am, are you prepared for the potential complications this might create?" I looked once more at my parents, still greeting guests and accepting sympathy for their loss, completely unaware that their world was about to shift in ways they'd never imagined. The decision to reveal truth instead of maintaining comfortable fiction felt right, in ways I hadn't expected, not because it would vindicate me personally, but because it would honor the reality of service that Marcus had tried to begin and I had devoted my life to completing. "Captain Walsh," I said, straightening my dress uniform jacket and checking that my insignia were properly positioned, "sometimes the truth emerges whether we plan for it or not. Today, we're simply going to stop preventing that emergence." She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd watched me navigate complex situations before, and together, we prepared to step into a moment that would redefine everything my family thought they knew about military service, sacrifice, and the daughter they'd never bothered to truly see. The VFW hall buzzed with the energy of a community gathered to honor its fallen heroes. Red, white, and blue bunting draped every available surface, while folding chairs arranged in precise rows faced a small stage where local veterans would soon render honors to families who'd lost service members. The smell of coffee and homemade cookies drifted from the kitchen where VFW auxiliary members prepared refreshments for the reception that would follow. I stood at the back entrance with Captain Walsh, watching through a narrow window as the ceremony began. The VFW Honor Guard, 7 aging veterans whose combined service spanned from Vietnam to Afghanistan, posted the colors with movements that remained sharp despite their advanced years. Their uniforms bore the ribbons and badges of men who'd earned their respect through decades of service, sacrifice, and commitment that extended far beyond any single deployment or assignment. Commander William Harrison, a Vietnam veteran whose weathered face told stories of experiences my generation could barely imagine, approached the podium with the measured gait of someone who understood the weight of the moment. His voice carried across the hall with authority earned through combat leadership and tempered by years of honoring fallen comrades. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Harrison began, his words silencing the last whispered conversations, "we gather today not just to remember those we've lost, but to honor the families who continue to carry their legacy forward. Military service extends beyond the individual to encompass entire families who share in both the pride and the burden of defending our nation." From my position near the entrance, I could see my parents in the front row, my mother clutching a tissue while my father sat with the rigid posture of someone determined to maintain composure during an emotional ceremony. Beside them sat other Gold Star families, people who'd experienced genuine loss and whose presence lent gravity to an occasion my parents had transformed into validation of their fictional narrative.
Commander Harrison continued his opening remarks, speaking about sacrifice in terms that resonated with authentic experience rather than manufactured sentiment. Today, we recognize families who understand that freedom requires vigilance, that peace demands strength, and that the cost of liberty is measured not just in lives lost, but in the ongoing commitment of those who continue to serve. His words carried weight because they emerged from personal knowledge of what military service actually demanded. The formal portion of the ceremony proceeded with military precision, each element designed to honor genuine sacrifice while maintaining the dignity appropriate to such occasions. A young Marine corporal read the names of local service members killed in action, his voice steady as he recited details of their service and the circumstances of their deaths. Each name represented a real story of commitment that ended in ultimate sacrifice, creating a stark contrast to the embellished narrative my parents had constructed around Marcus's brief training period. When Commander Harrison announced that they would now hear from their distinguished guest speaker, I felt the familiar calm that preceded any significant operation. Captain Walsh opened the rear door, and I stepped into the hall wearing my full-dress uniform, the insignia of my rank clearly visible to anyone familiar with military protocol. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Commander Harrison's expression shifted from polite anticipation to sharp recognition as he processed the rank insignia on my uniform. The other veterans in attendance, men and women trained to identify military hierarchy at a glance, straightened in their seats with the automatic respect accorded to senior officers. A ripple of awareness spread through the crowd as people recognized that their guest speaker was not the mid-level officer they'd been expecting. My parents' faces remained turned toward the podium, waiting for the introduction of someone they assumed would validate their son's brief service. They had no reason to look toward the back of the hall where their dismissed daughter was walking down the center aisle in a uniform that proclaimed achievements they'd never imagined possible. Commander Harrison recovered his composure with the adaptability of someone who'd learned to handle unexpected situations under pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying new undertones of respect, "please welcome our honored speaker, General Isabella Chen-Sullivan." The word general echoed through the hall like a stone dropped into still water, creating waves of recognition that spread outward from those who understood its significance. My mother's head snapped around so quickly I thought she might injure herself. Her face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as she processed the uniform, the insignia, and the impossible reality that her irrelevant daughter was being introduced as the highest-ranking military officer to ever enter their small town. My father's mouth opened and closed without sound, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the woman approaching the podium with his long-held assumptions about my career. The other Gold Star families turned to look at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect, their genuine military experience allowing them to recognize the significance of my rank even if they didn't understand the family dynamic suddenly playing out before them. Mrs. Patricia Coldwell, whose son had died in Afghanistan, gave me a solemn nod of acknowledgement that carried more weight than any applause. I reached the podium and accepted the microphone from Commander Harrison, who whispered quietly, "Ma'am, it's an honor to have you here." His words carried genuine respect, unmarked by the confusion and shock radiating from my parents' section of the audience. For him, my rank and presence were simply facts, to be acknowledged and honored according to protocol. "Thank you, Commander Harrison," I replied, my voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. "It's my privilege to be here among so many families who understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the audience, taking in the faces of people who'd gathered to honor genuine loss and commitment. "Military service," I continued, "is often misunderstood by those who haven't experienced it directly. We sometimes focus on the dramatic moments, the heroic actions that make headlines, while overlooking the daily commitment, the quiet sacrifices, and the ongoing dedication that defines a life spent in service to something greater than ourselves." My words were carefully chosen to honor authentic service while avoiding validation of the fiction my parents had constructed. I could see my mother gripping my father's arm, her knuckles white with tension as she processed the implications of what was happening. Their narrative about Marcus's heroic service was being overshadowed not by contradiction, but by the simple presence of someone whose actual military career dwarfed their fictional accounts. The other attendees listened with respectful attention, unaware of the personal drama unfolding in the front row. "Today, we honor families who've experienced loss in service to our nation," I said.
We also recognize that military families often serve in ways that remain invisible to the broader community. The spouse who manages a household through multiple deployments, the children who attend new schools every few years, the parents who worry silently about children stationed in harm's way. My father's face had shifted from shock to something approaching panic as he realized that their elaborate preparations for honoring Marcus's memory were being eclipsed by revelations about the daughter they'd systematically dismissed. The memorial banner they'd commissioned, the reception they'd planned, the media attention they'd courted, all of it was being recontextualized in ways they'd never anticipated. Military service comes in many forms, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional turbulence I could feel radiating from my parents. Some serve for decades, rising through ranks that require increasing responsibility and sacrifice. Others serve briefly, their potential cut short by circumstances beyond their control. Both deserve our respect, but we must be honest about what each represents. The words hung in the air with implications that only my family fully understood.
I wasn't attacking Marcus's memory or diminishing his intent to serve, but I was establishing a framework that distinguished between potential and achievement, between intention and accomplishment. The other attendees nodded along with what seemed like reasonable observations about military service, unaware that they were witnessing a family reckoning disguised as a ceremonial address. Commander Harrison watched from the side of the stage with the professional composure of someone who learned to navigate unexpected situations, but I could see him processing the undercurrents of what was happening. The other veterans in attendance maintained respectful attention while clearly recognizing that something significant was occurring beyond the formal ceremony they'd expected. I want to conclude, I said, preparing to wrap up remarks that had served their purpose without creating unnecessary drama. By thanking the families here today for their sacrifices, and by encouraging our community to truly understand what military service entails before we attempt to honor or celebrate it. The final words carried weight that only my parents could fully appreciate, a gentle but unmistakable call for honesty over fiction. The applause that followed was respectful and sustained, led by the veterans who understood they just heard from someone whose rank commanded their professional admiration. My parents didn't applaud. They sat frozen in their seats, processing implications that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their family, their daughter, and their own credibility within the military community they'd been courting. As I stepped down from the podium, Commander Harrison approached with the bearing of someone who recognized both my rank and the complex situation I'd just navigated. "General," he said quietly, "that was exactly what the ceremony needed. Would you be willing to participate in the wreath-laying portion of our service?" His invitation acknowledged my position while offering an opportunity to honor the genuine military families present. I accepted, joining the small procession that moved to the memorial garden where my parents had arranged for Marcus's name to be added to a plaque honoring local service members. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to help honor my brother's memory in a setting my parents had created, while having no idea their other child had earned honors that dwarfed anything they'd imagined possible. The wreath-laying ceremony proceeded with military dignity, each participant placing flowers at the memorial while a bugler played taps. When my turn came, I placed a small arrangement while silently acknowledging both Marcus's unfulfilled potential and the reality of service that had shaped my own life. The moment felt appropriate and respectful, honoring genuine loss without validating fictional narratives. As the formal ceremony concluded, people began moving toward the VFW hall for the reception my parents had organized. I found myself surrounded by veterans and military families who wanted to express their appreciation for my remarks and my service. Their respect was genuine and unforced, based on recognition of actual achievement rather than manufactured celebrity. Mrs. Caldwell approached with the quiet dignity of someone who'd experienced real loss. "General," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authentic grief, "thank you for reminding us what service really means. My son would have appreciated hearing those words." Her comment carried more validation than any applause, representing acknowledgement from someone who understood military sacrifice firsthand. My parents remained near the memorial, accepting condolences from people who were clearly confused by the day's revelations, but too polite to ask direct questions about the family dynamics they'd witnessed. My mother's carefully planned reception was proceeding, but the focus had shifted in ways she'd never anticipated, with guests more interested in discussing my unexpected presence than Marcus's memorial. Commander Harrison found me near the refreshment table, where I was speaking with several local veterans about current military operations. "General," he said,
I hope you'll forgive the direct question, but I'm curious about the family situation here. Your parents seem surprised by your rank and position. His words carried no judgment, just professional curiosity about circumstances that clearly involved more complexity than a simple ceremony. Commander, I replied carefully, military families sometimes experience communication challenges, especially when security clearances limit what can be shared about one's work. Today provided an opportunity for clarity that's been lacking for some time. My response acknowledged the situation without providing details that might embarrass my parents further or create additional complications. He nodded with understanding born from decades of military experience. I've seen similar situations. Classified work can create distance between service members and their families. Sometimes that distance becomes difficult to bridge. His words carried the wisdom of someone who'd navigated similar challenges throughout his own career. As the reception continued, I noticed my parents gradually isolating themselves from the crowd, their discomfort growing as more people approached me with questions and comments about my service. The narrative they'd constructed about their family's military contributions was being overwhelmed by reality they'd never bothered to discover, creating cognitive dissonance that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The local newspaper reporter who'd planned to cover Marcus's memorial found herself with a much more significant story than she'd anticipated. Her questions about my service and position required careful answers that maintained security protocols while acknowledging the community interest in learning about a hometown resident who had achieved senior military rank. My security detail maintained their discreet presence throughout the reception, a reminder that my position carried responsibilities and requirements that extended far beyond family ceremonies. Captain Walsh monitored communications while ensuring that my appearance didn't create complications for ongoing operations or security concerns. As the afternoon wound down, I prepared to return to Washington and the duties that couldn't be delayed for family events. My parents approached hesitantly, their faces showing the strain of processing revelations that challenged everything they believed about their daughter and their family's relationship with military service. "Isabella," my mother said, her voice uncertain in ways I'd never heard before, "we need to talk. There are things we clearly don't understand about your work, your position." Her words carried none of the dismissive confidence that had characterized her previous assessments of my career, replaced by something approaching respect tinged with bewilderment. "Mother," I replied gently, "I have always been available to talk. You've simply never asked the right questions or shown interest in answers that didn't fit your preferred narrative." My response wasn't accusatory, just factual, acknowledging the communication barriers that had developed over years of mutual misunderstanding. My father stood slightly behind her, his earlier confidence completely evaporated.
"General," he said, the title feeling awkward in his mouth, "I think we owe you an apology. We clearly didn't understand the importance of your work or the significance of your achievements." His words carried genuine remorse, though I wondered whether it stemmed from recognition of their mistakes or simply from embarrassment at their public revelation. "No apology is necessary," I told them both. "You honored Marcus today in ways that felt meaningful to you, and I honored the families here who've experienced real loss. Both purposes were served." My response maintained dignity for everyone involved while avoiding the kind of dramatic confrontation that would serve no constructive purpose. As I prepared to leave, Commander Harrison approached one final time. "General," he said, "I hope you'll consider speaking at future events. Your presence here today reminded everyone what military service actually looks like at its highest levels." His invitation acknowledged my position while offering opportunities to continue supporting the veteran community that understood my achievements. The drive back to Washington provided time to process the day's events and their implications for my relationship with my family. The revelation of my actual rank and position had been inevitable once I accepted the speaking engagement, but the reality of watching my parents confront their misconceptions proved more complex than I'd anticipated. Captain Walsh maintained professional silence during most of the journey, understanding that I needed time to decompress from an event that had been both professional duty and personal reckoning. Only as we approached the Pentagon did she speak. "Ma'am, how do you feel the day went overall?" she asked, her question acknowledging both the ceremonial success and the family complications. "Captain," I replied, "sometimes truth emerges whether we plan for it or not. Today provided clarity that's been needed for years, and I think that clarity ultimately serves everyone involved. My assessment focused on the positive outcomes while acknowledging the challenges that truth sometimes brings. The following weeks brought changes in my family dynamics that were subtle but significant. My parents' calls became more frequent but less presumptuous, filled with questions about my work that they'd never bothered asking before. Their social media posts about military families began including mentions of my service, though they clearly struggled to explain why they'd never mentioned their daughter's rank previously. My mother's veteran advocacy work continued, but with new humility about the complexity of military service and the dangers of assuming understanding without authentic knowledge. My father began reading military news with genuine interest rather than cursory attention, trying to educate himself about the world his daughter inhabited. The most significant change came in their relationship with Marcus's memory. They continued honoring his intent to serve, but with greater honesty about the brevity of his actual service and the tragedy of potential unfulfilled. Their memorial efforts became more focused on supporting current service members rather than aggrandizing past sacrifice. Commander Harrison kept his word about future speaking engagements, and I found myself returning to my hometown several times over the following year to address veteran groups and military families. These events provided opportunities to support my community while maintaining the professional relationships that had become important to my work. The security clearances and classification levels that had once isolated me from family understanding became topics of respectful curiosity rather than dismissive assumptions. My parents began to appreciate that my inability to discuss specific work details reflected the importance of my responsibilities rather than their irrelevance. 6 months after the Memorial Day ceremony, my mother called with news that she'd been elected president of the local military family support group. "Isabella," she said, her voice carrying pride mixed with humility, "I told them about your service when they asked about my qualifications. I hope that was appropriate." Her request for permission represented a fundamental shift in how she viewed my achievements. "Mother," I replied, "you can share whatever you think is relevant. My service record isn't classified, just some of the specific operations I've been involved in." The conversation represented progress toward understanding that had been absent from our relationship for years. A year later, I was promoted to lieutenant general, achievement that required Senate confirmation and generated news coverage that reached my hometown newspaper. My parents called immediately, their voices filled with genuine pride untainted by the competitive comparisons that had once characterized their responses to my successes. "We're proud of you," my father said simply. "We always should have been, but we understand that now." His words carried the weight of recognition that had been years in the making, acknowledgement of achievements they'd finally learned to appreciate. The Memorial Day ceremony had served its purpose in ways none of us had anticipated. Truth had emerged not through confrontation or accusation, but through simple presence and honest representation of what military service actually entailed. The revelation changed everything while preserving dignity for everyone involved. Marcus's memory remained honored, but with greater accuracy about what his brief service represented. My parents' advocacy work continued, with enhanced credibility based on authentic understanding rather than manufactured narrative. My own relationship with my family evolved toward mutual respect based on truth rather than comfortable fiction. The experience taught me that truth doesn't require dramatic revelation to be powerful. Sometimes the most profound changes come from simply allowing reality to exist without the filters of assumption, dismissal, or willful ignorance that prevent understanding. Military service, like most meaningful endeavors, speaks for itself when given the opportunity to be seen clearly. The months following the Memorial Day revelation brought unexpected developments that continued to reshape my family's understanding of military service and my place within it. What I hadn't anticipated was how the truth would ripple outward beyond our immediate family circle, affecting relationships and perceptions throughout our small community in ways that would prove both challenging and ultimately rewarding. Marcus's memory remained honored, but with greater accuracy about what his brief service represented. My parents' advocacy work continued, with enhanced credibility based on authentic understanding rather than manufactured narrative. My own relationship with my family evolved toward mutual respect based on truth rather than comfortable fiction.
The experience taught me that truth doesn't require dramatic revelation to be powerful. Sometimes the most profound changes come from simply allowing reality to exist without the filters of assumption, dismissal, or willful ignorance that prevent understanding. Military service, like most meaningful endeavors, speaks for itself when given the opportunity to be seen clearly. The months following the Memorial Day revelation brought unexpected developments that continued to reshape my family's understanding of military service and my place within it. What I hadn't anticipated was how the truth would ripple outward beyond our immediate family circle, affecting relationships and perceptions throughout our small community in ways that would prove both challenging and ultimately rewarding.
3 weeks after the ceremony, I received a call from Mayor Sandra Mitchell, a woman I'd known peripherally during my childhood but hadn't spoken with in over a decade. Her voice carried the careful politeness of someone navigating unfamiliar protocol territory. "General Chen-Sullivan," she began, clearly practicing the use of my rank, "I hope you don't mind my calling directly, but our city council has been discussing ways to properly recognize your achievements and your service to our country." The conversation that followed revealed how thoroughly my parents' previous narrative had influenced local perceptions. Mayor Mitchell explained that the city had been planning to name a small park after Marcus based on my parents' advocacy and their description of his military service. Now, with a fuller understanding of our family's actual military contributions, the council was reconsidering their approach to military recognition in general. "We don't want to diminish your brother's memory," the mayor assured me, "but we also realize we may have been operating with incomplete information about military service and sacrifice. Would you be willing to meet with our Veterans Committee to help us develop more appropriate ways to honor local military families?" Her request reflected a broader community recognition that their understanding of military service had been shaped more by emotion than accuracy. The Veterans Committee meeting took place in the same VFW hall where the Memorial Day ceremony had occurred, but the atmosphere was markedly different. The committee members, a mix of veterans from different eras and conflicts, approached the discussion with the seriousness of people who'd learned to distinguish between genuine military achievement and well-intentioned but misguided recognition efforts. Frank Rodriguez, a Korean War veteran who served as committee chairman, opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "General, we've been honoring military service in this community for 50 years, but recent events have made us realize we might not always understand what we're actually honoring. We want to do better, and we need guidance from someone who understands military service at the highest levels." The conversation that followed was both educational and humbling. These veterans had genuine respect for military achievement, but they'd been influenced by my parents' narrative about Marcus's service without having the knowledge to assess its accuracy. My presence provided an opportunity to establish criteria for military recognition that reflected actual achievement rather than emotional appeal. Military service, I explained to the committee, encompasses everything from basic training to 4-star command, and each level deserves appropriate recognition. The challenge is matching the honor to the service, ensuring that we celebrate genuine achievement without inflating lesser contributions beyond their actual significance. My words weren't meant to diminish Marcus's memory, but to establish frameworks that would prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. The committee's questions revealed how much confusion existed about military ranks, duties, and achievements, even among veterans who'd served decades earlier in very different military structures. Contemporary military operations, classification levels, and career progressions were foreign concepts to men who'd served in simpler times with clearer distinctions between combat and support roles. Over the following hour, I found myself providing an informal education about modern military service, explaining how careers developed, how security clearances worked, and how different types of service contributed to national security in ways that weren't always visible to civilian communities. The committee members listened with genuine interest, clearly recognizing that their previous assumptions had been based on incomplete understanding. The outcome of that meeting was a complete revision of the city's approach to military recognition. Instead of naming facilities after individual service members based on family advocacy, they developed criteria that required verification of actual service records and achievements. They also established an education component that would help community members understand different types of military service before attempting to honor them. Marcus's name remained on the memorial plaque at the cemetery, but with accurate information about his brief service rather than the embellished narrative my parents had created. The small part that had been planned in his honor was instead dedicated to all local military families, with recognition that service takes many forms and deserves proportionate acknowledgement. My parents struggled with these changes initially, feeling that their son's memory was being diminished by accuracy rather than enhanced by it. The transition required numerous conversations about the difference between honoring Marcus's intent to serve and claiming achievements he'd never had the opportunity to earn. These discussions were difficult but necessary, helping them understand that truth ultimately served everyone's interests better than fiction. The process of community education extended beyond formal committees to informal social situations that proved equally challenging to navigate. At a neighborhood barbecue 6 months after the Memorial Day ceremony, I found myself surrounded by people who'd known me since childhood, but were struggling to reconcile their memories of the quiet teenager with the reality of my current position. Tom Bradley, who'd lived next door during my high school years, approached with the awkward enthusiasm of someone trying to rewrite their understanding of a familiar person. "Izzy," he said, using the childhood nickname that sounded strange coming from an adult addressing a general, "I have to ask, were you always planning this military career, or did it just kind of happen?" His question reflected genuine curiosity mixed with embarrassment about having dismissed my potential during our youth. These social interactions required careful navigation between maintaining appropriate professional dignity and preserving personal relationships that predated my military career. People who'd known me as Robert and Patricia Sullivan's quiet daughter were struggling to integrate that memory with the reality of my current responsibilities and achievements. The challenge was compounded by well-meaning neighbors who wanted to claim retroactive credit for recognizing my potential despite having paid no attention to my achievements throughout my actual development. Mrs. Henderson, who'd lived across the street during my teenage years, began telling people that she'd always known Isabella was destined for great things, conveniently forgetting her previous dismissive comments about my academic focus. These social adjustments were minor compared to the changes occurring within my immediate family. My parents' relationship with me evolved from dismissive indifference to respectful curiosity, but the transition wasn't smooth or immediate. They had to learn entirely new ways of relating to a daughter they'd never bothered to understand, while I had to decide how much of my guarded privacy I was willing to share with people who'd forfeited their access to my inner world years earlier. My mother's approach was to overcompensate through excessive pride and public bragging that felt as uncomfortable as her previous dismissal. She began introducing me to strangers as my daughter, the general, with an emphasis that suggested she was claiming credit she'd never supported or understood. Her social media posts shifted from memorializing Marcus to celebrating my career, but with the same lack of genuine understanding that had characterized her previous military advocacy. My father's adjustment took a different form, characterized by awkward attempts to engage with my work that revealed how little he understood about military operations or strategic responsibilities. He began reading military publications and watching news programs about defense policy, but his questions demonstrated that he was trying to learn an entirely foreign language without proper foundation or context. "Isabella," he said, during one particularly uncomfortable phone conversation, "I read about that situation in the South China Sea. Were you involved in planning our response to that crisis?" His question revealed both genuine interest and complete ignorance about security classifications, operational security, and the inappropriateness of discussing classified operations with family members who lacked proper clearances. These conversations required patience and education about the boundaries that necessarily existed between my professional responsibilities and family relationships. My parents had to learn that their newfound respect for my career didn't automatically grant them access to information that remained classified regardless of our family connection. My mother's approach was to overcompensate through excessive pride and public bragging that felt as uncomfortable as her previous dismissal. She began introducing me to strangers as my daughter, the general, with an emphasis that suggested she was claiming credit she'd never supported or understood. Her social media posts shifted from memorializing Marcus to celebrating my career, but with the same lack of genuine understanding that had characterized her previous military advocacy. My father's adjustment took a different form, characterized by awkward attempts to engage with my work that revealed how little he understood about military operations or strategic responsibilities.
He began reading military publications and watching news programs about defense policy, but his questions demonstrated that he was trying to learn an entirely foreign language without proper foundation or context. Isabella, he said during one particularly uncomfortable phone conversation, I read about that situation in the South China Sea. Were you involved in planning our response to that crisis? His question revealed both genuine interest and complete ignorance about security classifications, operational security, and the inappropriateness of discussing classified operations with family members who lacked proper clearances. These conversations required patience and education about the boundaries that necessarily existed between my professional responsibilities and family relationships. My parents had to learn that their newfound respect for my career didn't automatically grant them access to information that remained classified regardless of our family connection.
The most significant challenge came when my promotion to lieutenant general was announced, generating news coverage that reached national media outlets and required congressional confirmation hearings that were broadcast on cable news networks. My parents watched these proceedings with a mixture of pride and bewilderment, finally understanding that their daughter's career had achieved levels they'd never imagined possible. The confirmation hearings provided a public education about my background, achievements, and responsibilities that filled gaps in my family's knowledge while creating new complications for our relationship. Senators questioned me about operations I'd led, strategies I'd developed, and positions I'd taken on international security issues, revealing the scope of my actual influence on national policy. My mother called immediately after the hearings concluded, her voice carrying emotions I'd never heard from her before. Isabella, she said, I watched the entire thing. I had no idea about any of what they discussed. How did we never know about the work you were doing, the responsibilities you had? Her question reflected genuine bewilderment rather than defensive justification for their previous dismissive attitude. Mother, I replied carefully, you never asked, and when I tried to explain, you weren't interested in answers that didn't fit your assumptions about government work. Security classifications limited what I could share, but your lack of interest limited what I was willing to share. My response acknowledged both the practical constraints and the personal dynamics that had created our communication breakdown. The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion we'd ever had about our family relationships and the mutual misunderstandings that had shaped them. My parents began to recognize that their dismissive attitude had been based on ignorance rather than insight, while I acknowledged that my withdrawal had contributed to their lack of understanding about my career and achievements. These family discussions coincided with broader community recognition that extended beyond correcting previous misconceptions to genuine appreciation for local military achievement. The regional newspaper ran a feature story about my career that provided context for my accomplishments while educating readers about the complexity of modern military service and the significance of senior leadership positions. The article generated responses from other military families in the area who'd felt their service was underappreciated or misunderstood by civilian communities. Commander Harrison contacted me about organizing a regional military appreciation event that would provide accurate information about different types of service while honoring genuine achievements appropriately. Planning this expanded military recognition event required coordination between multiple veteran organizations, active duty military representatives, and civilian community leaders who wanted to demonstrate genuine understanding rather than superficial patriotic sentiment. The complexity of organizing such an event highlighted how much education was needed about military service, even among people who claim to support and honor veterans. My role in planning extended beyond simple participation to helping design educational components that would prevent future misunderstandings about military ranks, responsibilities, and achievements. We developed informational displays about different military occupational specialties, career progression paths, and the significance of various awards and decorations that often went unrecognized by civilian communities. The event, held on Veterans Day 6 months after the original Memorial Day ceremony, drew participants from across the region and provided a model for other communities seeking to honor military service with appropriate understanding. My parents attended as genuine supporters rather than the fictional military family advocates they'd previously represented themselves to be. Watching my parents interact with real military families at this expanded event, I could see them learning to appreciate the complexity and diversity of military service in ways they'd never considered before. They spoke with Gold Star mothers whose sons had died in combat, veterans dealing with PTSD from multiple deployments, and active duty families managing the challenges of frequent relocations and extended separations. These interactions provided context that helped my parents understand that military service encompassed experiences far beyond the brief training period Marcus had completed. They began to appreciate that their son's death, while tragic, represented unfulfilled potential rather than heroic achievement, and that genuine military families dealt with challenges they'd never experienced or understood. The community education aspect of these events proved valuable beyond simple military recognition. Local businesses began offering genuine support to military families rather than superficial gestures based on misconceptions about military life. Schools developed curricula that taught students about military service with accuracy rather than romantic mythology. My own participation in these community education efforts provided opportunities to give back to the hometown that had raised me while using my position to promote genuine understanding of military service. The work was personally satisfying in ways that my classified operational responsibilities, however important, couldn't match because of their necessarily secret nature. The transformation of my relationship with my family and community also affected my professional perspective in unexpected ways. Having finally achieved genuine recognition from the people who'd raised me, I found myself less dependent on external validation and more focused on the intrinsic satisfaction that came from meaningful service regardless of public acknowledgement. This shift in perspective influenced my approach to leadership within my military assignments, where I began placing greater emphasis on developing junior officers who might be struggling with recognition or appreciation for their contributions. My experience with family misunderstanding provided insight into the challenges faced by service members whose work remained invisible to the people closest to them. The mentoring relationships I developed with junior officers became some of the most rewarding aspects of my military service, providing opportunities to ensure that talented individuals received the guidance and support I'd had to develop independently. These relationships also helped me understand that family recognition, while personally important, was less significant than professional acknowledgement from colleagues who understood the true value of one's contributions. A year after the Memorial Day revelation, my hometown held its first annual Military Appreciation Festival, an event that had evolved from the simple ceremony where truth had finally emerged to challenge comfortable fiction. The festival featured educational displays, guest speakers, and recognition ceremonies that honored genuine military achievement while providing accurate information about the complexity and diversity of military service. Standing on the same VFW stage where I'd first revealed my true rank to a community that had never bothered to ask the right questions, I reflected on how truth had ultimately served everyone's interests better than the comfortable lies that had previously shaped our understanding of military service and family relationships. The revelation had been challenging for everyone involved, but it had led to growth, understanding, and genuine appreciation that benefited our entire community. The experience taught me that truth doesn't require dramatic confrontation to be powerful, but it does require the courage to let reality exist without the filters of assumption, dismissal, or willful ignorance that prevent genuine understanding. Military service, like most meaningful endeavors, speaks for itself when given the opportunity to be seen clearly and judged accurately rather than through the lens of preconceived notions or emotional narratives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.